He received a mysterious letter after his grandmother's death, and the trail led him to an old cemetery. There, under his grandfather's grave, he discovered a secret door. As he climbed down, he saw something that made his heart freeze. What was hiding this secret passage, and how would it change his life? Watch to the end to find out the whole truth. ... Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what you would do in his shoes. The sky was a dull gray, and a thin drizzle fell over the old cemetery, casting a cold haze on everything it touched. Raindrops slid off the edges of black umbrellas, mingling with quiet sobs and whispered condolences. The autumn air carried a damp chill that seemed to seep into the bones, settling a weight on the hearts of those gathered. Among the small crowd, standing by the freshly dug grave, was Jerome. His broad shoulders hunched under the burden of grief and loneliness. The polished casket, half lowered into the ground, held the body of his grandmother, the only family he had left. She had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was only 7. She had been his anchor, the one person who had shielded him from a world that often treated him with suspicion and disdain. Her loss felt like the final thread snapping in an already fragile tapestry. Jerome's dark skin stood out among the mourners, a stark reminder of the unspoken divide that lingered even in moments of shared sorrow. He noticed how some of the white attendees, there more out of obligation than affection, kept a subtle distance. Their eyes held a mixture of pity and discomfort, as if grief was an unwelcome guest at a table already too full. He caught snippets of murmured conversations, half-heard phrases that pricked at his wounds. Poor boy, he's always had it rough. What will he do now? Such a shame, they never quite fit in. He forced himself to look away, fixing his gaze on the casket as the pastor spoke. The words were gentle, comforting perhaps, but they washed over him like the rain, cold, distant, and unable to reach the warmth he had lost. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the memories of his grandmother. Her laughter, rich and full of life, echoed in his thoughts. He remembered her hands, worn but gentle, as she braided his hair when he was a child, telling him stories of their family's past. She had been his guide, his protector, and now she was gone. As the ceremony came to an end, the crowd began to disperse. People approached him, offering hugs, pats on the back, and words that felt thin and hollow. Some of them he knew from church, others were old neighbors, and a few were just faces he had seen around town. One by one they left, their presence fading into the mist until he stood nearly alone, the cemetery shrouded in the quiet rustle of rain on leaves, but not quite alone. A figure remained by the iron gate, partially obscured by the twisted branches of an old oak. It was an elderly woman, her silver hair damp and clinging to her lined face. She wore a long, dark coat, its hem brushing the wet ground. Her eyes, a striking gray, fixed on him with an intensity that made him uneasy. She moved toward him slowly, her steps careful on the slippery grass. When she reached him, she extended a hand, wrinkled and delicate, holding an old, weathered envelope. "For you," she said, her voice soft but clear. Jerome hesitated, his eyes moving from her face to the envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges frayed. His name was written in careful, familiar cursive. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on birthday cards, on notes left in his lunchbox as a child, on the reminders stuck to the fridge. It was his grandmother's handwriting. "She wanted you to have this," the woman continued. "She gave it to me long ago, said I should pass it on when the time came." He took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the rough surface. "Who are you?" The woman's expression remained calm, but something unreadable passed over her features. "Just an old friend," she said. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She believed in you. She always did." Before he could ask more, she turned and walked away, her figure melting into the rain and shadows. Jerome stood there, the envelope heavy in his hand, its weight more than just paper and ink. He felt the sting of curiosity, the slow burn of a mystery he hadn't known existed. His grandmother had never been one for secrets, at least not with him. She had always been open, sharing stories about their family's struggles, teaching him to hold his head high despite the world's attempts to make him feel small. But this, an envelope given in secret by a stranger, it didn't fit. As he made his way back to his small apartment, the rain continued to fall, the world around him a blur of wet pavement and dim streetlights. The envelope remained clenched in his hand, a promise of something unknown. Once inside, he sat on the edge of his bed, the room dimly lit by the single lamp on his nightstand. His fingers trembled as he carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. The handwriting greeted him like an old friend, familiar yet distant, as if the words had traveled through time to reach him. "Dear Jerome, if you're reading this, then I am no longer with you. I've lived a long life, filled with joy and hardship, and through it all, you are my greatest blessing. I know life has not been kind to you, that you have faced more obstacles than most, but you are strong, stronger than you know. There is something you need to know, something I could not tell you while I was still alive. Our family has a legacy, one that has been hidden for generations. It is not just about money, but about purpose. If you are willing to follow my instructions, you may find what you have always been looking for, a chance to change your life and maybe even the lives of others. Trust yourself, my dear. You are more than what the world sees. You are part of something much greater. With all my love, Grandma." Jerome's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations, old stories, and hidden glances. A legacy? A purpose? He felt a pull, a need to understand what she meant. The rain tapped against the window, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of his heart. He sat in the quiet of his room, the letter laid out before him, and knew that this was only the beginning. The apartment was silent except for the rain tapping against the window. Jerome sat on the edge of his bed, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows across the room. The letter from his grandmother lay open in his hands, the words still fresh in his mind, yet they felt distant, like echoes from another time. A legacy, a purpose. He read the letter again, hoping to extract some hidden meaning he had overlooked. His grandmother had never spoken of any family secret before. She had been a woman of wisdom and strength, always guiding him with honesty. If there was truly something important for him to discover, why had she never mentioned it? Why wait until after her death? His fingers traced the edges of the envelope, and he noticed that it wasn't empty. There was something else inside. Carefully, he reached in and pulled out a second, smaller piece of paper, aged and delicate as if it had been handled many times before. It was a rough sketch of a cemetery map. His breath caught as he recognized the location immediately. It was the same cemetery where she had just been buried, but the mark on the map wasn't near her grave. It was elsewhere, in an older section where the tombstones were worn by time and the names had begun to fade. Next to the marked spot, in his grandmother's familiar handwriting, was a single word: dig. Jerome stared at the map, his heart pounding. The rational part of his mind told him this was crazy. The idea of digging up a grave, no matter what secrets it held, felt wrong. But another part of him, the part that had always trusted his grandmother's guidance, whispered that there was a reason she had left this for him. Still, questions filled his mind. What exactly was he supposed to find? How was he supposed to do this without drawing attention? And most of all, why him? He set the map down and leaned back against the wall, rubbing his temples. Doubt clawed at him. Maybe he was reading too much into this. Maybe it was nothing more than a misguided attempt to leave him with hope in her absence. But then he remembered. He remembered the way his grandmother had spoken about their family's struggles, not just personal ones, but those rooted in history. The stories she had told him about ancestors who had fought for their freedom, for their dignity, for their place in a world that had always tried to push them aside. She had once told him about his great-great-grandfather, a man who had been more than just a survivor. He had been a fighter. He had been part of something bigger, something that had helped shape their people's future. Had she been hinting at this all along? Had she always known there was something waiting for him to discover? The thought sent a chill through him, not from fear, but from realization. Maybe this wasn't just about money. Maybe it wasn't about escape. Maybe this was about something far greater than himself. The weight of the envelope in his hands felt heavier now, as if it carried the expectations of generations. His grandmother had believed in him enough to leave him this message. He couldn't ignore it. His mind raced through logistics. He would have to go at night, unseen. He couldn't afford to be caught digging up a grave. Society wouldn't be kind to a black man in a cemetery with a shovel, no matter what his reasons were. He would need to prepare, to be careful. His body tensed with anticipation. This was reckless, dangerous, but for the first time since her passing, he felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. And that, more than anything, made his decision for him. Tomorrow night he would go. The night was heavy with silence. The city beyond the cemetery hummed with distant life. Cars moving along wet streets, the occasional wail of a siren. But here among the dead, the world felt still. Jerome stood by the iron gate, his hood pulled low over his face, a shovel gripped tightly in his hand. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him, but he pushed the hesitation aside. He had made his decision. There was no turning back. Slipping through the gate, he moved carefully between the tombstones, each step muffled by damp grass. The graveyard smelled of rain-soaked earth and decaying leaves. His breath was steady, but his pulse quickened as he reached the spot marked on his grandmother's map. The tombstone before him was old, its inscription worn down by time. He crouched and traced the carved letters with his fingers, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The name was barely legible, but the date confirmed what he already knew. This grave belonged to someone from his past, someone his grandmother had wanted him to find. He hesitated only a moment longer before sinking the shovel into the soft earth. The first scoop was the hardest. The sound of metal scraping against soil seemed deafening in the quiet night. He paused, listening, waiting for any sign that he had been noticed. Nothing. He kept digging. With each thrust of the shovel, he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. His arms ached, sweat forming despite the cool night air. He thought of his ancestors, of their struggles, of the secrets buried with them. The deeper he dug, the more he felt as if he was reaching for something beyond just answers. He was touching the past, breaking through time itself. Then his shovel struck something solid. Jerome froze, heart hammering against his ribs. He dropped to his knees and brushed away the dirt with his hands. The wooden surface beneath his fingers was rough, old, but still intact. It wasn't a coffin. It was something else. A box. He worked quickly, freeing it from the soil, pulling it up until it rested on the edge of the grave. His hands trembled as he wiped away the dirt, revealing the intricate carvings on the lid, symbols he didn't recognize, but which carried an unmistakable sense of importance. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the history etched into the wood. Lifting the lid, he braced himself for what lay inside. The first thing he saw was paper. Bundles of old, yellowed documents tied together with fraying twine. He reached for one, carefully unraveling it, his eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a ledger filled with names, dates, transactions. But these weren't ordinary financial records. His breath caught as he realized what he was looking at. It was a record of people. People who had been bought and sold. His stomach twisted. These were records of slavery. Page after page documented lives reduced to numbers, human beings treated as property. The reality of it crashed over him with a force he wasn't prepared for. These weren't just strangers. These were his ancestors. Their names were here, their suffering immortalized in ink. Beneath the documents was something else, an old, leather-bound book. He flipped it open and found handwritten notes, journal entries. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. His great-great-grandfather's name was scrawled across the first page. Jerome read, his hands shaking. The words painted a picture of defiance, of rebellion. His ancestor had been more than just a survivor. He had fought against the system that sought to erase him. He had helped others escape using money stolen from those who had enslaved them. And before he was caught, before he was killed, he had hidden the last of it, ensuring it would never be used for evil again. Jerome's breath came in shallow gasps as he reached the final pages. His ancestor had left a message, written in hurried strokes as if time had been running out. To the one who finds this, you are my blood. You are my legacy. If you stand at this grave, it means our fight is not over. What I leave behind is not just gold, not just history. It is a choice. You must decide what comes next. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in cloth, was a stack of bills. Old, but real. Money that had waited for generations to be claimed. Jerome sat back, staring at the contents of the box, his mind racing. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a responsibility. The night stretched around him, silent, expectant. He had found the truth. Now he had to decide what to do with it. Jerome sat in the damp earth, his hands trembling as he stared at the contents of the box before him. The weight of history pressed down on him like the very soil he had just unearthed. The documents, the journal, the money, it was all real. The records of human lives bought and sold, the legacy of suffering that his ancestors had endured, and the final message left behind by a man who had defied the system at the cost of his own life. His mind swam with thoughts, emotions colliding like waves in a storm. He had expected something valuable, something secret, but this was more than he had imagined. This was proof of the past, evidence of horrors that had shaped his family, his people, his very existence. And now the responsibility of that knowledge rested on his shoulders. A choice. That was the word that lingered in his mind, echoing through his thoughts like a bell tolling in the night. His ancestor had left him not just money, but a decision. What he did next could change everything. The night air pressed against him, cool and damp, but the heat of his racing thoughts burned within him. He needed to think. He needed to understand. But more than anything, He needed to get out of there before someone saw him. Jerome carefully repacked the box, tying the twine around the documents and wrapping the stack of bills in the cloth again. He lifted it from the grave, glancing around the cemetery to make sure he was still alone. The world beyond the iron gates remained quiet, the distant hum of the city muffled by the trees and the weight of what he had discovered. He hesitated before standing, his eyes drifting back to the open grave. The tombstone before him, worn and cracked, had stood for over a century, marking the resting place of a man who had lived and died for something greater than himself. Jerome reached out and pressed his fingers against the stone, a silent acknowledgement of the past, a wordless promise that he would not let this knowledge be forgotten. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he grabbed his shovel and began covering the hole he had dug. He worked quickly, pushing the damp soil back into place, erasing the evidence of his trespass. His muscles ached from the effort, but he didn't stop until the ground looked undisturbed, the only sign of disruption the mud now clinging to his clothes and hands. Lifting the box carefully, he made his way out of the cemetery, his breath shallow, his senses heightened with the awareness that at any moment he could be seen. But luck, or perhaps fate, was on his side. He reached the gate without incident, slipped back into the streets, and disappeared into the darkness. The city seemed indifferent to his discovery. Neon lights flickered in store windows, cars rolled by, their tires hissing against the wet pavement. Life continued as if nothing had changed, but for Jerome, everything had. When he reached his apartment, he locked the door behind him and placed the box on his small kitchen table. He stood over it for a long time, staring at it as if expecting it to vanish, as if questioning whether any of it had truly happened. But the mud on his hands and the ache in his back told him it was real. With a deep breath, he sat down and carefully opened the box again. The documents were fragile, the ink faded in some places but still legible. He unfolded one of the pages and read the names listed there, each one a person whose life had been stolen, whose story had been reduced to a number on a ledger. And then he found something else. Beneath the stack of papers, hidden beneath the folds of cloth that held the money, there was another slip of paper. This one was different, newer, less fragile. He pulled it out and unfolded it, his heart pounding as he recognized his grandmother's handwriting. Jerome, if you've come this far, then you've already made the first choice, to seek the truth. But the real decision still lies ahead. This is not just about the past, it's about what you do with it. The money you found was never meant for one person. It was meant to help, to heal, to rebuild what was taken from our people. That is the purpose of this legacy. If you choose to keep it, then you must also choose what kind of man you will become. But there is more. The answers you seek are not only in this box. There is another place you must go, another piece of the story waiting to be uncovered. Our family's history runs deeper than you know. And if you truly want to understand, you must be willing to dig further, not just into the past, but into yourself. Go to the house where your great-great-grandfather lived. The answers are there. Trust yourself, my boy. I always did, Grandma. Jerome let out a slow breath, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper. It wasn't over. There was more to find, more to uncover. His grandmother had known all along, had planned for this moment even before she left this world. She had trusted him with this burden, with this responsibility. His great-great-grandfather's house. He had never been there, Never even known much about it, but if it still stood, then it was a relic of a time long past, a piece of history waiting to reveal its secrets. Jerome felt something stir inside him, something beyond curiosity, beyond fear, a sense of duty, of purpose stronger than anything he had felt before. He would go. He had to. Pushing away the exhaustion settling into his bones, he reached for his phone. A quick search told him what he needed to know. The house still existed, though it had long been abandoned. It sat on the outskirts of town, a relic left to decay, forgotten by time. But not forgotten by his grandmother. Not forgotten by history. He looked at the clock. It was late, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. His mind was too restless, his thoughts too tangled in the possibilities of what awaited him. He would go at dawn. With a steadying breath, Jerome gathered the papers, the journal, the money, and placed them back into the box. He closed the lid, knowing that what he had discovered tonight was only the beginning. Tomorrow, he would take the next step. The morning light cast long shadows across Jerome's small apartment as he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wooden box. The weight of it was more than physical. It carried the burdens of generations, of a history both painful and powerful, and now it sat before him, waiting for him to decide its fate. The air in the room felt heavy with expectation, as if even the walls held their breath, waiting for his next move. The money inside the box was real. It wasn't just old bills crumbling with time. It was wealth, untouched, waiting to be used. He had counted it in the early hours before dawn, his hands trembling as he flipped through stacks of cash, his mind struggling to comprehend what it meant. There was more than he had expected, enough to change his life completely, enough to leave everything behind and start over. The thought of escape pressed against the edges of his mind like a whisper, tempting, insistent. He could leave. He could take the money, disappear to another city, maybe even another country. No more struggle, no more judgmental looks, no more feeling like he had to fight just to exist. He could reinvent himself, create a new identity free from the weight of history, free from the expectations placed on him by those long dead. But every time he let the thought take root, another voice rose within him, his grandmother's voice, the echo of her words in the letter she had left. This money was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to help, to change lives, to be used for something greater than just one man's escape. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face, exhausted from the war waging inside him. He had spent his whole life watching people with power hoard their wealth while others suffered. He had seen the way the system was designed to keep people like him struggling, scraping by, always just one step away from losing everything. And now, here he was, faced with the same choice. Did he keep the money and secure his own future, or did he honor the legacy left behind for him? His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the days when his grandmother would sit with him at the kitchen table, telling him stories about their ancestors. He had always loved listening to her, the way her voice would rise and fall like music, the way her eyes would shine with passion when she spoke of the past. She had taught him to be proud of who he was, to never let the world tell him he was worth less than anyone else. She had taught him that history mattered, that knowing where you came from was the key to knowing where you were going. He thought of the times he had been told he wasn't good enough, that he would never amount to anything. He thought of the job interviews where he had been overlooked, the moments when he had been followed in stores, the times he had felt the weight of prejudice pressing down on him like an invisible hand. He thought of the people who had struggled beside him, the friends who had been forced to give up on their dreams because they had no other choice. If he took this money and ran, what would he be saying to them? Would he be proving everyone right? That when given the chance he would choose himself over his people? He exhaled sharply and pushed away from the table, pacing the small room, the wooden floor creaking under his steps. His mind raced through the possibilities, weighing the consequences of each path before him. The longer he thought about it, the clearer the answer became. His great-great-grandfather had risked everything to hide this money, not for himself, but for a greater purpose. His grandmother had known the truth, had spent her entire life protecting this secret, waiting for the right moment to pass it on. They had believed in something bigger than themselves. Could he do the same? Could he walk away from the easy road, the road that promised comfort and security, and instead choose the one filled with uncertainty, with struggle, but also with meaning? He stopped pacing and looked down at the box. This wasn't about wealth, it was about justice. His fingers hovered over the lid for a moment before he opened it again, staring at the contents with new eyes. The journal, the documents, the records of stolen lives, they weren't just relics of the past. They were proof. They were the foundation of something bigger, something that could shake the very roots of the world if used correctly. And the money, this money could be the fuel to set that change in motion. The temptation to keep it still lingered, whispering to him that no one would blame him if he took it, that he deserved it, that he had suffered enough to earn his freedom. But freedom at the cost of forgetting. Freedom at the cost of letting the past be buried once again. No, that wasn't who he was. That wasn't who he wanted to be. He grabbed his phone and opened a search browser. He needed to know what organizations existed that could use this money. He needed to find people who were already fighting, who knew how to turn resources into real change. If he was going to do this, he wasn't going to do it alone. The weight on his chest lifted slightly. The choice had been made. And now it was time to act. Jerome had made his decision, but the path ahead was still uncertain. The money in the box was no longer just an inheritance. It was a responsibility, a burden that had been passed down through generations, waiting for the right moment to be used. He knew he couldn't rush into anything without a plan. If he wanted to honor his ancestors' sacrifice, he had to be smart about it. The morning light streamed through the window of his apartment, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. He had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities. He had spent hours researching, reading about organizations that work to uplift Black communities, legal funds for those who had been wrongfully convicted, schools that were underfunded and in desperate need of resources. The more he read, the more he realized just how much work needed to be done. His first step was to find someone he could trust. He couldn't just walk into a bank and deposit a large sum of money without raising suspicion. The bills were old, some dating back decades, and he had no idea if they were still in circulation or if they would trigger an investigation. The last thing he needed was law enforcement questioning where he had gotten so much cash. He thought about the people in his life. Who would understand? Who wouldn't ask too many questions but would still help him do the right thing? His mind immediately went to Mr. Carter, the owner of a small bookstore in the neighborhood. The man had always been more than just a business owner. He was a mentor, a community leader, someone who had spent his life fighting for justice in quiet but powerful ways. Jerome grabbed his jacket and the box, securing it in a backpack before heading out. The streets were waking up as he made his way toward the bookstore, the hum of the city growing louder with each passing block. He moved quickly, keeping his head down, his nerves on edge. Even though he had done nothing wrong, carrying a bag full of money made him feel like a criminal. The bell above the bookstore door jingled softly as he stepped inside. The familiar scent of old paper and wood filled his lungs, grounding him. Mr. Carter stood behind the counter, adjusting his reading glasses as he glanced up. The older man had a presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His gray beard and deep-set eyes gave him the air of someone who had seen too much, but still held on to hope. "Jerome," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. "Haven't seen you in a while. You doing okay?" Jerome hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. "I need to talk to you about something big." Mr. Carter studied him for a long moment before motioning toward the back of the store. "Come on, let's sit down." They moved to a small office lined with the bookshelves overflowing with history, philosophy, and activism. Jerome placed the backpack on the desk, unzipping it carefully before pulling out the wooden box. He opened the lid, revealing the stacks of old bills, the documents, and the journal. Mr. Carter's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened with understanding. He reached out, running his fingers over the brittle pages of the records, his touch reverent. "Where did you find this?" Jerome took a deep breath and told him everything. The letter from his grandmother, the grave, the hidden chamber, the choice he had struggled with. He spoke about his great-great-grandfather, the money that had been taken from the oppressors and hidden away, waiting for someone to use it for the right cause. When he finished, Mr. Carter leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "This is more than just money, son. This is a piece of history, and history, when used right, has power." Jerome nodded. "I don't want to waste it. I don't want to be selfish, but I don't know where to start." The older man was silent for a moment before he stood and walked to one of the shelves. He pulled down a book, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. "There's a foundation that helps fund Black-owned businesses, education initiatives, and legal defenses for those who've been wronged by the system. It's run by people who actually care, people who don't just take money and disappear." He slid the book across the desk. "Start there." Jerome picked up the book, flipping through the pages. The foundation had been established decades ago, built on the idea that economic empowerment was the key to breaking cycles of oppression. It wasn't just about charity. It was about creating lasting change. He felt a surge of something he hadn't expected. Hope. Mr. Carter tapped the edge of the wooden box. "You've been given something rare, Jerome. A chance to do what so many before us never could. But you have to be careful. Money like this, money with history attached to it, draws attention, and not all attention is good." Jerome understood. This wasn't just about writing a check and walking away. It was about strategy, about making sure the money went where it was needed without getting lost in bureaucracy or, worse, corruption. "I need time to figure it out," Jerome admitted. Mr. Carter smiled. "You've got time. But don't wait too long. The world doesn't stop just because we're trying to do the right thing." Jerome nodded, closing the box and securing it back in his bag. As he walked out of the bookstore, he felt lighter than he had in days. The choice had been made, and now there was a path in front of him. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but for the first time he wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about what came next, about what he could build, about how he could honor the past while shaping the future. And that was a path worth walking. Jerome had always known that change didn't come easy. His grandmother had told him stories of marches, of protests, of people fighting battles not just in the streets, but in courtrooms, in schools, in boardrooms where decisions were made by those who had never lived a day in struggle. But knowing something in theory and experiencing it firsthand were two different things. He had made his choice. He had committed to using the money for good, but he hadn't anticipated just how much resistance he would face. At first, things moved smoothly. With Mr. Carter's guidance, Jerome connected with a foundation that helped fund initiatives for Black-owned businesses and education programs. He wanted the money to be put toward something lasting, something that would continue to benefit people long after it was gone. He sat through meetings with community leaders, with activists who had been fighting for years, with business owners who had dreams but no resources to make them real. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had power, real power, to make a difference. But power always came with opposition. It started with whispers, subtle things that might have been easy to ignore if he hadn't been paying attention. He overheard conversations where people questioned where the money was coming from, speculated that it couldn't be legitimate. Some assumed he had gotten involved in something illegal, that a man like him couldn't possibly have access to wealth unless it was through crime. Others simply didn't believe that he, a young black man with no formal background in finance or activism, had any business trying to change the system. Then came the threats. At first, they were just vague warnings, anonymous messages sent to his phone, letters slipped under his apartment door. They all carried the same message. Stop what you're doing. Walk away while you still can. He didn't know who they were coming from, but he didn't have to. The world had never been kind to those who tried to shake the foundations of power. The people who benefited from oppression never gave up their control without a fight. One night, as he was leaving a meeting with local activists, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. He had seen it before, always lingering just out of sight, but now it was closer. He didn't let himself panic. He had grown up knowing how to move carefully, how to be aware of his surroundings. Instead of going straight home, he took a different route, watching to see if the car followed. It did. He turned into an alleyway, forcing himself to stay calm. His heart pounded, but he knew fear wouldn't help him. He reached for his phone, ready to call someone, but before he could, a voice called out behind him. "You don't know what you're getting into, kid." Jerome turned slowly. A man stepped out from the shadows, dressed in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't some random thug. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who operated in the spaces most people never even realized existed. "I don't know who you are," Jerome said, keeping his voice steady, "but I know exactly what I'm getting into." The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. "You think you're different? You think you're going to change anything? I think I'm going to try." A slow smirk crossed the man's face. "You're young. That's your mistake. You don't understand how the world works yet. You don't get that money isn't just money. It's power. And people like you don't get to have that kind of power." Jerome clenched his fists. He had heard versions of this before his whole life. The idea that people like him were meant to struggle, to accept whatever scraps they were given. He had spent years trying to play by the rules, trying to fit into a system that had never been built for him. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. "You can try to scare me," Jerome said. "You can send your threats, you can follow me around, but I'm not stopping." The man sighed, almost as if he was disappointed. "Then you won't last long." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The SUV was gone by the time Jerome stepped back onto the main street, but he knew this wasn't over. When he got back to his apartment, he sat in the darkness, his mind racing. He thought about his great-great-grandfather, about how he had risked everything to fight for freedom, knowing that it could cost him his life. He thought about his grandmother, about how she had carried the weight of this secret for decades, protecting it, waiting for the right person to take up the fight. He had always known this wouldn't be easy, but now he understood just how dangerous it would be. He wasn't just dealing with the struggles of poverty, of systemic racism, of communities fighting to survive. He was stepping into a battlefield where power was protected by people who would do anything to keep it. But if they were afraid of him, if they thought he was a threat, then that meant he was doing something right. And he wasn't going to stop now. The world did not change overnight. Jerome knew this from the start. Change was slow, often painfully so, inching forward through resistance and inertia. But persistence, he learned, was more powerful than any single act of defiance. His great-great-grandfather had known this too. The journal left behind was filled with not just stories of rebellion, but with plans, careful, methodical, designed to outlast oppression. Jerome decided that his actions would honor that legacy, not just with grand gestures, but with steady, consistent work. The threats did not stop. The SUV still lingered at the edges of his vision. The anonymous letters became more aggressive, and some of his allies began to grow uneasy. Mr. Carter, always a voice of wisdom, cautioned him to remain vigilant, to protect not just his mission, but his own safety. Jerome took the advice seriously, surrounding himself with people he could trust, sharing information strategically, ensuring that if something happened to him, the work would continue. The foundation he had partnered with began to see the impact of his contributions. Grants for Black-owned businesses started to materialize, offering struggling entrepreneurs the chance to build and thrive. Schools received funding for new programs. Scholarships were created, and young people who had been told their dreams were too big started to believe in their own potential. Each success, no matter how small, was a victory, a piece of history rewritten with hope instead of pain. But there were battles that tested his resolve. At a community meeting, an older man stood up, his voice edged with skepticism. He questioned Jerome's motives, echoing the suspicions that had been spreading. How do we know this isn't just a scam? How do we know you're not just another person coming in here, taking what you want, and leaving us with nothing? The room had fallen into a heavy silence, all eyes turning to Jerome. He understood the man's distrust. It came from a lifetime of broken promises, from seeing too many people walk away when things got hard. Jerome had not been there for those old wounds, but he felt their sting all the same. "I can't ask you to trust me," Jerome had said, "but I can show you. I'm not here to take anything. I'm here to build something with you. And if I ever stop doing that, if I ever put myself above this community, then you call me out. Hold me accountable. That's how this has to work." Over time, his actions began to speak louder than words. The same man who had questioned him became one of his strongest supporters, volunteering to help distribute resources, to talk to his neighbors about what was possible. Trust was not given easily, but when earned, it was unshakable. Through all of this, Jerome continued to dig into his family's history. The more he learned, the clearer it became that his ancestors' fight was not just about surviving, but about creating a foundation for those who would come after her. His great-great-grandfather had written about land that had been stolen, about rights denied, about dreams deferred but never abandoned. Jerome felt a profound connection to these stories, not just as history but as a roadmap for what came next. With the help of lawyers and historians, he began to file claims, to push for reparations not only for his family, but for others whose histories had been buried under layers of injustice. It was a long process, filled with red tape and legal maneuvering, but he was relentless. His grandmother's voice remained in his mind, a guiding light reminding him why this mattered. There were moments when the weight of it all threatened to break him. The pressure from those who wanted him to fail, the exhaustion of constantly pushing against barriers, the personal toll it took on his health and his spirit. But every time he reached a breaking point, he found strength in the stories of those who had come before him. His ancestors had faced worse, had stood against forces far more powerful, and had done so knowing they might not see the fruits of their labor. One afternoon, as he stood at the community center he had helped fund, surrounded by children laughing and learning, he felt a sense of peace he had not known before. He watched as young people, who had once felt invisible, found their voices, their talents, their futures. It was not the end of the journey, but it was a milestone, a marker that told him he was on the right path. The SUV stopped showing up. The threats faded into silence. He realized then that those who had tried to intimidate him had given up, not because they approved of his actions, but because they knew they could not stop him. His strength came not from his own will alone, but from the collective power of a community that had decided to fight back against a history that had never served them. Years passed. Jerome's work expanded beyond his neighborhood, reaching into other cities, partnering with national organizations that saw the potential in what he was building. He became a symbol of what was possible when legacy met purpose, when wealth was used as a tool for justice rather than for personal gain. People began to tell his story alongside those of his ancestors, a continuation of a narrative that stretched back through generations. When he stood on the stage at a national conference, receiving an award for his work in community development, he thought of his grandmother. He could almost hear her voice, soft and steady, reminding him that he was not just living his own story, he was living theirs. He was carrying forward dreams that had been planted long before he was born. The applause washed over him, but it was not for him alone. It was for all those who had walked this path before him, for those who had fought and struggled, who had believed that a better world was possible even when everything around them said otherwise. He left the stage with a quiet resolve. There was still work to be done, still stories to tell, still lives to change. But he no longer walked alone. He was surrounded by a new generation, by people who had been inspired not just by his story, but by the legacy he had chosen to uphold. And as he looked into their faces, he knew that the fight would continue, that the legacy would live on, not as a memory of pain, but as a testament to the power of perseverance and the unyielding pursuit of justice. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Share this video with others who might find it interesting, and check out our other videos for more compelling stories.